Right now, as you watch this video, the President of the United States and the CEO of the world's most valuable private company are in a room negotiating something that has never happened in American history. Not a bailout, not a regulation, an ownership deal. The government of the United States is being offered a personal, direct stake in the machine that might replace your job. And the man offering it isn't doing it out of generosity, he's doing it because he's scared. This is the story of how OpenAI tried to buy political protection with $42.6 billion of its own stock, and why that number might be the most important figure in the entire history of artificial intelligence policy. Welcome back to the AI Ledger. Let's get into it. To understand why this moment matters, you need to understand what's actually happening underneath it. This isn't a story about generosity. This is a story about fear. Corporate fear, political fear, and a kind of fear that ordinary Americans have been feeling for a while now without quite being able to name it. The fear that a handful of private companies are building something powerful enough to reshape the entire economy, and nobody elected them to do it. On July 2nd, 2026, the Financial Times published an exclusive report citing two people directly familiar with the discussions. According to that report, OpenAI CEO Sam Altman had proposed in conversations with the Trump administration handing the United States federal government a 5% equity stake in OpenAI. Based on the company's valuation from its record-breaking funding round in March, $852 billion, that 5% slice would be worth approximately $42.6 billion. Within hours, the story was picked up by CNBC, CNN, Bloomberg, and Forbes. This wasn't a rumor floating around a Discord server. This was one of the most significant corporate government proposals in modern American history, breaking in real time. Now, before you picture Altman walking into the Oval Office with a giant check, let's be precise about what was actually being proposed, because the mechanism here is genuinely strange, and understanding it is the key to understanding everything else in this story. This isn't a stock purchase. The government isn't buying anything. What's being proposed is that OpenAI would voluntarily place 5% of its own equity into a new vehicle, something Altman has been calling, in public statements for months now, a public wealth fund. And the design template for that fund isn't a Silicon Valley invention. It's from Alaska. Here's the analogy Altman keeps returning to, and it's worth understanding fully because it's doing a lot of persuasive work. Back in 1976, Alaska created something called the Alaska Permanent Fund. The idea was simple. The state was sitting on enormous oil wealth, and rather than letting that wealth flow entirely into corporate profits, or government budgets that politicians could spend however they wanted, Alaska put a portion of the oil revenue into an investment fund. Every single year since 1982, that fund has paid a direct, unconditional cash dividend to every single Alaska resident, literally a check in the mail, funded by oil sitting under the ground that, in a sense, belongs to everyone in the state. As of this year, that fund holds roughly $91 billion in assets, and it paid out actual checks, real money, not tax credits, not abstract policy benefits, to hundreds of thousands of ordinary Alaskan families. Altman's argument is that artificial intelligence should be treated the same way oil was treated in Alaska in 1976. Not as a private windfall for the handful of people who happen to own equity in AI companies, but as a kind of national resource, something valuable enough and disruptive enough that ordinary citizens deserve a direct, tangible cut of the profits it generates. Not through taxes, not through some government program buried in a budget bill, through actual direct ownership. And on paper, that idea has a strange kind of populist appeal. If a technology is powerful enough to replace your job, shouldn't you at least own a piece of the machine that replaced you? But here's where you have to stop and ask the question that separates a genuine act of civic generosity from a brilliant, calculated act of political self-preservation. And to understand that, you need the timing. This proposal did not emerge in a vacuum. It landed just days, literally days, after an extraordinary moment where the US government directly intervened in OpenAI's product roadmap. The Trump administration had asked OpenAI to delay the full public rollout of its newest model, GPT 5.6. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick had reportedly warned Altman directly against releasing that model without government approval first. Think about the significance of that for a second. This is not a company operating in a free market, launching products whenever it wants. This is a company where a cabinet secretary can personally intervene and delay a launch. And it's not isolated. Around the same period, Anthropic, one of OpenAI's biggest competitors, spent 19 days with its most advanced models completely disabled worldwide under the first-ever U.S. export control order applied to an AI model rather than to physical hardware. Let that sink in! For nearly 3 weeks, a piece of software was treated by the U.S. government the same way you treat a fighter jet engine or an enriched uranium sample, something too powerful and too dangerous to let cross borders freely. This is the world OpenAI's proposal was born into. A world where the frontier AI labs have realized something uncomfortable. They are no longer just tech companies competing for market share. They are now, functionally, entities the U.S. government considers strategically significant enough to regulate, delay, and restrict at will. And in that world, offering Washington a stake in your company isn't generosity. It's leverage. It's insurance. It's a company trying to turn a regulator into a shareholder, because shareholders don't usually shut down their own investments. There's also historical precedent here that makes this proposal look less like an isolated bolt of inspiration and more like a well-worn playbook. Last August, the federal government took a 9.9% stake in Intel, converting CHIPS Act grant money into actual equity ownership. Around the same period, both AMD and NVIDIA agreed to hand over 15% of their revenue from China chip sales in exchange for the export licenses they needed to keep selling there. President Trump himself, discussing the Intel stake back in May, said publicly that he thought the government should have negotiated for even more ownership than it got. So when Trump later described the idea of the government holding stakes in AI giants as, in his words, a beautiful thing that would make Americans partners in the AI revolution, that wasn't a spontaneous reaction to Altman's idea. That was a president who had already tested this exact model on the semiconductor industry and liked what he saw. Which brings us to the second half of this story, the political pressure that makes all of this suddenly urgent, rather than theoretical. Because Altman's 5% proposal isn't happening in isolation. It's happening as a direct countermove to something far more aggressive. In mid-June, Senator Bernie Sanders introduced a bill called the American AI Sovereign Wealth Fund Act, and Sanders' proposal makes Altman's 5% offer look almost conservative by comparison. Sanders wants a one-time 50% tax on companies generating more than $200 million a year in AI-related revenue, paid not in cash but in actual company stock. Sanders estimates that fund could eventually be worth around $7 trillion and could pay out roughly $1,000 a year to every single American, funded by dividends off that pool of forcibly acquired equity. Sanders' underlying argument is that these AI systems were built on something that was never really private property to begin with. The collective published writing, art, code, and knowledge of essentially the entire human species, scraped and used to train these models largely without individual consent or compensation. His position is that if the raw material was collectively created, the profits shouldn't flow exclusively into a handful of private bank accounts in San Francisco. Now here's the strategic read that a lot of analysts have landed on, and it's worth sitting with. Altman's 5% voluntary offer looks a lot less like generosity and a lot more like a preemptive strike against Sanders' 50% mandatory seizure. If you're Sam Altman, and you know there's a serious piece of legislation in Congress that could eventually force you to hand over half your company, offering the government a much smaller voluntary slice right now, one you get to help design and frame publicly as visionary and public-spirited, is an extremely rational move. You get to look like the hero offering wealth to the American people, while simultaneously making the far more radical alternative look unnecessary and extreme by comparison. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just how corporate lobbying against unfavorable legislation typically works. You don't fight the bill directly, you make your own smaller version of it look like the reasonable compromise. Now let's talk about what nobody is quite saying out loud yet, which is how genuinely unprecedented and legally murky this entire mechanism actually is. According to the Financial Times' own reporting, these discussions are described as conceptual, preliminary, and early stage. There is no signed deal. There is no term sheet. Implementing something like this would almost certainly require an actual act of Congress, meaning this isn't something Altman and Trump can simply agree to over a phone call. It would need to survive the same legislative gauntlet as any major piece of federal policy, with all the amendments, opposition, and horse trading that implies. And the unanswered questions here are genuinely enormous. Who actually controls the voting rights attached to that 5% stake? Is this a passive treasury holding that just collects dividend checks, or does the federal government get an actual board seat with real influence over how OpenAI is run? Including, potentially, influence over its safety decisions, its research priorities, or which government contracts it pursues. Would the equity donation be tax-deductible for OpenAI's existing shareholders, effectively meaning private investors indirectly subsidize the government's new stake? How exactly would the dividends actually get distributed to citizens? A direct per-person check like Alaska, contributions into retirement accounts, or spending on public infrastructure instead? All three models have reportedly been floated, and none has been chosen. And then there's the antitrust question that almost nobody is talking about yet, but probably should be the loudest alarm bell in this entire story. What does it mean for the US government to hold a direct financial ownership stake in the single most dominant company in an industry it is also supposed to be regulating? If the Department of Justice or the FTC ever needs to investigate OpenAI for anti-competitive behavior or safety violations or data practices, how do you conduct an independent arm's-length investigation into a company the government itself now partially owns? This is a conflict of interest question that American antitrust law has essentially never had to confront at this scale before. Here's a detail that adds even more weight to all of this. At the exact same time these negotiations are unfolding, OpenAI is reportedly facing a sweeping investigation from a coalition of 42 different U.S. state attorneys general, and both OpenAI and Anthropic have confidentially filed paperwork for public stock offerings. Locking in a favorable government relationship and a friendly government equity stake right before a public listing isn't just about goodwill. It's about controlling the narrative and the regulatory environment at the single most vulnerable moment in a company's financial life. The moment right before it goes public and every decision it makes becomes subject to shareholder lawsuits, SEC scrutiny, and quarterly earnings pressure. So let's step back and ask the deep explanation question this story deserves. What actually is a sovereign wealth fund, and why does the mechanism matter so much here? A sovereign wealth fund, at its core, is simply an investment vehicle owned and controlled by a government, usually built from budget surpluses, natural resource revenue, or in this new and strange case, corporate equity donations. Norway has one of the largest in the world, built from oil revenue, currently worth over $1 trillion, and it invests broadly across global stock markets to fund the country's long-term public spending. Singapore has similar funds used to invest in infrastructure and strategic industries. What makes the Alaska model specifically relevant here isn't the size. Alaska's fund is actually one of the smaller sovereign funds globally. It's the distribution mechanism. Alaska pays a universal, unconditional cash dividend to every single resident, regardless of income, employment status, or need. That's the specific feature Altman is borrowing, because it lets him make an argument that sounds less like corporate tax policy and more like a populist promise. Everyone gets a check. No bureaucracy, no means testing, just a direct share of the wealth this technology is generating. Think of it like this. Imagine a company discovered a massive oil field underneath an entire country, except instead of drilling into the ground, they're drilling into something more abstract. The collective productivity gains, automation efficiencies, and economic value created when machines start doing work humans used to get paid for. Altman's argument is that since that value is being extracted from a kind of shared societal resource, the accumulated knowledge, creativity, and labor patterns of the entire economy, some portion of the resulting wealth should flow back to the public that generated the raw material in the first place, rather than disappearing entirely into private equity portfolios and IPO windfalls for early investors. It's a genuinely interesting idea. It's also, undeniably, a story a company facing potential 50% equity seizure legislation would be extremely motivated to tell. So, what does this actually mean going forward? For the industry, for government, and for you? For the AI industry, this sets up a fascinating structural fork in the road. If OpenAI actually signs a deal like this, Altman has publicly said he hopes other frontier labs follow suit. That puts enormous pressure on Anthropic, Google DeepMind, Meta AI, and xAI to either match the offer or publicly explain why they won't. Right now, reporting indicates the Trump administration and Anthropic haven't even opened talks on a similar arrangement, and Anthropic has declined to comment. That silence itself is a signal. Either Anthropic is quietly negotiating something different behind closed doors, or it's deliberately staying out of a structure it considers legally or ethically risky. For the government, this proposal, if it ever becomes real, would represent one of the largest direct federal ownership positions in a private technology company in American history, dwarfing even the Intel stake. It would also set a template other industries might start demanding or resisting. If AI labs are handing equity to the government to buy political goodwill, what happens when biotech companies, defense contractors, or social media platforms start being asked or start offering to do the same? For ordinary Americans, The honest answer is that nothing about this proposal is guaranteed to put a single dollar in your pocket anytime soon. This is, right now, an idea discussed in preliminary conversations between a handful of executives and a handful of cabinet officials. It requires congressional legislation that doesn't exist yet, a governance structure that hasn't been designed, and a distribution mechanism that's still just a set of competing options on a whiteboard somewhere in Washington. The Alaska Permanent Fund took years of legislative work, a constitutional amendment, and decades of disciplined investment management before it became the reliable annual dividend Alaskans now count on. There is no guarantee, and frankly very little historical precedent, suggesting a federal version of this gets built quickly, cleanly, or fairly. And here's the analytical point worth sitting with as we wrap up. This entire proposal exists in a strange, uncomfortable space between genuine policy innovation and pure political theater. On one hand, the underlying question Altman is raising: how do ordinary citizens share in wealth generated by a technology that could displace millions of jobs? Is one of the most important economic questions of this entire decade, and very few politicians on either side of the aisle have offered anything nearly as concrete as either Altman's proposal or Sanders's competing bill. On the other hand, the timing, the framing, and the sequence of events, a government-mandated product delay, followed almost immediately by a voluntary ownership offer, followed by public comparisons to a wildly popular state program that pays literal cash to residents, reads less like philanthropy and more like one of the most sophisticated pieces of regulatory capture attempted in the history of the tech industry. Both things can be true simultaneously. That's usually how the biggest stories in this industry work. A real important policy question wrapped inside a very calculated piece of corporate self-preservation delivered at exactly the moment it does the most good for the company offering it. So where does this actually go from here? Watch 3 things closely over the coming months. Watch whether this proposal ever produces an actual term sheet rather than just anonymous sourcing in newspaper reports. Watch whether Sanders's 50% bill gains any real legislative traction in Congress, because that's the pressure that makes Altman's smaller offer look reasonable by comparison. And watch whether any other frontier AI lab, Anthropic, Google, Meta, or xAI, actually joins this public wealth fund structure, because a single company offering equity is a headline. 4 or 5 of the most powerful technology companies on Earth doing it together is an entirely new economic institution. Because that's really what's being negotiated here, underneath all the press releases and anonymous sourcing. Not just a stock transfer, a test of whether the most powerful, least regulated technology of our generation ends up serving the public that made it possible, or just the handful of people who happened to own equity when it got built. The number is $42.6 billion, but the real number, the one that actually matters, is however many millions of American jobs this technology touches before anyone in Washington finishes deciding who actually owns the upside. Thanks for watching the AI Ledger. If you want to understand what's really happening behind the headlines instead of just reacting to them, make sure you're subscribed, because this fight over who owns the future of AI is just getting started. See you in the next one.